Hi, everybody. I'd love to introduce Zuzana Burivalova from University of Wisconsin, who leads the Sound Forest Lab and just measures the ecology from the sensors we have with your sound. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg, for the introduction. My name is Zuzana Burivalova, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology and the Nelson Institute. And I am really excited to talk to you about the work that I do with my lab called the Sound Forest Lab. And as you have guessed, we use sounds to do something with the forest. And specifically, we're trying to understand how we can use sounds and soundscapes to estimate how much biodiversity, how many animal species are in rainforest. And this is super important for conservation because we can't really be conserving tropical forest biodiversity if we don't even know how much of it is in the forest. So let me step back a little bit and talk a little bit about how do people measure biodiversity in tropical forests. If we think back to the 60s, we would create something called vegetation maps, usually to estimate biodiversity. This is one of my favorite maps from the northern Madagascar, and it's a vegetation map that was created a little bit based on aerial photography, a little bit based on surveys on the ground, like vegetation surveys and geology surveys, and a lot based on guesswork. But we were able to get basically a classification of Madagascar's vegetation into the main types, and we were able to know which species are likely to grow where. Well, forward 60 years, we're still doing the same thing. We're making vegetation maps, but the resolution, the amount of information we're able to get has skyrocketed. So nowadays, we can use hyper-resolution satellite images or even just drone images like this one I took in Gabon last summer. And we can get not only information on where forest is and where it's missing because of deforestation, but we can also see even the individual species. We can tell if trees are dying or if they're flowering or fruiting, for example. But now I would like you to consider what we're missing from these very high resolution images and what else is there to learn about. And if this works, you should be able to now hear sounds from this same forest.
Yeah, we do.
All right, so I usually like to ask people what do they think it is that they are hearing, but I'm not sure if people on the call are able to take a guess or write it in the chat.
Myself, I heard something very monkey-like, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, it was a chimpanzee, and it was a pretty excited one, as you could probably tell, and even in the middle you could hear it kind of drumming on the tree trunk. So suddenly we know a lot more about this forest in Gabon. We know not only that chimpanzees live there, and we can identify how many different individuals there might be and what are they up to, what are they doing. But from the same sound recording, if we listen a little bit longer, we're actually able to identify a lot more species that are at the same site in the same forest. And not only mammals, not only primates, but also bird species and even frogs and a lot of insects. So my work is trying to basically make the most of the sounds that we can record in a rainforest to understand about the species that are making those sounds. And ultimately, we want to know if a forest that's, let's say, supposed to have 8 species like this, whether it truly has them or whether some of these species are missing. And on this slide, I've been showing pictures of the animals and also spectrograms. And spectrograms are the main way we are usually looking at the sound data. So it's just a picture of the sound with frequency on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. All right, so the goal of my work and of this talk is to talk about how do we develop a tool to monitor tropical forest biodiversity in a cheap way that's robust, objective, and effective, so that we can improve conservation decisions. And I should say, if there are questions even during the talk, feel free to interrupt me. I'll be happy to give more detail at any point. So I would talk about a little bit about bioacoustic monitoring in general, first of all, to introduce it as a technique. And then I have three examples, three vignettes of different ways we can analyze bioacoustic data. And I'll mention each example from different tropical forests. So first of all, how does the workflow, how is it when we first of all have these animals that are making sounds in the rainforest? The next step is collecting those sounds. So we usually use automated recorders that don't have to be supervised. They're left in the forest for as long as months to years. Then we have to process that data, and then we do some ecological analysis to finally, hopefully, make some useful conservation decisions. The recording of the data suddenly became much easier, let's say 10 years ago, with the decrease in size of batteries and improvements in memory storage. So you can now easily deploy one of these recorders that you see on the top left and leave it in the forest for months, hoping it doesn't get invaded by termites as it has in this picture. Obviously, in the tropics, everything is a little harder because of the high humidity and difficulties in access. But relatively speaking, the difficult part nowadays is the processing and the ecological analysis. We're gathering huge amounts of data, at least huge for the scales that ecologists are used to operate at. And we are having actually a lot of trouble processing these large quantities in a meaningful way. There are two major approaches which people use to analyze soundscape data. So the first approach is something called soundscape indices. And these are numbers or indices that we calculate about the whole soundscape without necessarily knowing what made what sounds. The advantage is that we can just process thousands and thousands of hours of audio relatively easily, but we don't always really know what these indices truly mean. So let's say one index could calculate how complex, how quickly does the sound change in a recording. But we don't know, is it changing because of the rain or because of species changing in the rainforest? So we don't know really who made the sounds. But these indices can be useful to get kind of an approximate idea of when the soundscapes are really busy, when are they monotonous, or when are they complicated. The second approach is focusing on the actual individual species that make the sound. And this is obviously super useful because we can tell, yes, the chimpanzee was there at such and such time. We can even tell when it wasn't there, or at least wasn't making sound. And we can start estimating how many individuals were there. The tricky thing is that it's still very expensive in terms of time to develop these algorithms for each species. And the biggest problem in tropical forests is that for a lot of species, we have absolutely no idea what kind of sounds they make. This is especially true for insects and frogs. So even if I have the chance of tracking down the 1 of 5 living experts on crickets in Indonesia, they might not know what species makes what sound. So there is a lack of reference libraries or lack of training data. So I personally work in both of these approaches, and I've also tried to develop an approach that bridges these two approaches. And today I want to mention these two approaches, looking at a whole soundscape, looking at individual species, and my in-between bridging approach, trying to look at just broad animal groups like frogs and birds and mammals. So for the first part, I'll talk about soundscape indices. And I want to play you one more soundscape with the idea that you might be able to guess which country it comes from, or at least the continent. Any guesses?
All I can hear is a few birds chirping and maybe a swampy kind of whoop whoop kind of sound.
I like the swampy characterization. It's actually a soundscape from a forest in Mexico in the Yucatan Peninsula.
Mm.
And it's from a forest that is used by local communities to extract wood. And what we're interested in, and the communities are interested in, is being able to understand from the soundscapes how healthy the forest that they're managing is. Are they exploiting it in a way for wood that is sustainable? Or is the biodiversity in the forest kind of suffering and declining over time? And so my goal as a scientist is to develop a soundscape index that can help us measure to what degree these forests are intact and whether they're degraded. So here I've lined up a picture kind of series from an intact forest on the left to selectively logged forest, which looks pretty normal from a satellite image, but it has few trees missing here and there, to all the way to a completely cleared area for, let's say, all palm plantations or, I don't know, pineapple plantation, and then to forestry plantations on the right. So on the right, it's a newly established tea plantation. And we want to use soundscapes not only to understand the status of biodiversity within an intact forest, how it might be changing because of climate change or hunting, but also how it changes with degradation of forests by selective logging. And the tricky thing is, so as ecologists or conservation scientists, we have a fair idea of what is the impact of, let's say, selective logging on average. We know that roughly 80% of species survive in a selectively logged forest. But there is so much variation, and companies can do logging really responsibly or really badly. And we need to be able to monitor on a case-by-case basis, how well is this company doing? Imagine that you have a lot of money saved up and you want to invest it in a reforestation project to help the environment. You don't want to know just on average whether reforestation works or not. You want to know, does my project where I put my money, does it conserve biodiversity, or is it just a carbon plantation? So the idea is to use soundscapes really on a case-by-case basis, so that each company, each conservation project can use them to analyze their biodiversity. So an important criteria for me that I have specified for myself together with conservation NGOs is that an index that will summarize this sound data has to be intuitive. People that are not soundscape ecologists have to be able to tell, okay, this is good and this is bad. It is to be valid, so it has to represent how actually animals are existing, and is to be robust across regions. So we don't want to have one index for a teak plantation in Myanmar and another one for a logging concession in Mexico. Ideally, we want to have something that will work in all tropical forests. There are a lot of soundscape indices out there. There are more than 60. If you're interested, there's a good review of them in the paper I list below. And most people are not satisfied with how good any of the indices is. And that's why many people develop their own. I developed my soundscape index called Soundscape Saturation. And it's definitely not the only usable index, but I want to try to convince you that it's intuitive, valid, and robust. So how does the soundscape saturation work? This is a cartoon of a soundscape where we have time of the day on the x-axis and frequency, so the pitch of the animals on the y-axis. And the idea is that over thousands and tens of thousands of years, species have evolved to partition this communication space so that they maximize signal transmission. Species that's, I don't know, a small bird and it's vocalizing at 1 kilohertz would not want to have a competing species vocalizing at the same frequency. So species have diversified in terms of the pitch and the timing of their vocalizations. And the idea is that if species start missing from a landscape, from a forest, we would be able to see and quantify these gaps in the soundscape. And we can then calculate how filled up the soundscape is with sounds at different frequencies and over different time, and then use that as a proxy of how many different species there are. So we would just be converting each of these frequency time bins and calculating basically the number of decibels in each bin. And that is called power minus noise. It's just a number of decibels. We could then make a kind of cutoff threshold so that if we have one really, really loud parrot sitting right next to the microphone and vocalizing really strongly at its frequency, it doesn't kind of drown out the rest. So each frequency time bin that crosses a certain amount of acoustic power gets 1. Otherwise, if it's too quiet, it's probably just wind or rustling of leaves, then it gets a 0. And then for each minute of the day, we can summarize what proportion or what percentage of these frequency bins are filled up or saturated with animal sounds. And at that point, we can start looking at trends in soundscape saturation over time at different sites and so on. And on this graph, this is the soundscape saturation of that forest that I showed you with the chimpanzee. And you can see that during the day, and the grayish polygons are basically nighttime, you can see that there are these 2 prominent peaks, one in the morning and one in the evening. And those correspond to the dawn and dusk chorus that exists pretty much even anywhere in the world. If you wake up really early, you might be woken up by birds making a lot of sound. So that's the dawn chorus.
Mm-hmm. The this plot is the fraction of those frequency cells that are occupied. That's the y-axis.
Yes. So for example, 80% or 85% on the y-axis would mean that 85% of frequency bins are filled up with a sound that's loud enough to likely be more than just wind. And each frequency bin is about 43.1 hertz, so it's relatively narrow.
So is there a problem with using static bins? I mean, in the sense that you have cutoffs, and I mean, some like low frequency might require bigger bins. I'm just sort of not sure.
Yes, so it's definitely not. It can never be 1-to-1 translation of like 1 bin equals 1 animal.
Okay, that's what you want. So I guess, yeah, to what extent is this not that?
Yes. And I'll show some data kind of explaining to what extent it's not that.
Yeah.
But having bins that are constant in the frequency size is possibly a disadvantage for some reasons, but it also can be an advantage that we can then compare between different forests that might have a different animal assemblage.
That makes sense. So then on that comparison of different forests, it seems like let's say baseline. Do you have a forest with no species? Do you have a forest that's unhealthy? Like, how do you calibrate something like this, especially globally?
I see. Like, what would a soundscape look like for a forest with no species?
Yes. Or just unhealthy. But unhealthy in Mexico versus unhealthy in Indonesia.
Yes. Okay. Great. I'll show you what it looks
Cool.
like. Oh, I mean, kind of. So I want to show you how this index behaves on soundscapes from these 3 different countries, from Myanmar, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. And in each country, I will show different land use types. So some will have intact forests, some will have basically forests that are no longer there. It's soundscapes collected over 3 years at just over 300 sites. And they were collected by my collaborators and me at different times with the same equipment and with like same parameters. So first of all, I'll show you how do we actually validate the index. How can we trust it or not? So this is a spectrogram, like I've showed you before. And what we do, we would have an expert who's like trained at listening and looking at these spectrograms, manually identify every single sound that can be heard and classify it. Okay, is this a chimpanzee? Is this a parrot? And so on. For a lot of species, the expert will not know what species it is, and they will then classify it in what we're calling sonotypes, basically types of sound. So that the unknown species that sounds a little bit like, I don't know, an orangutan, but it's not, will always get the same number. Let's say, I don't know, 15. So we have these sonotypes, and then we can calculate in any given minute from our data set how many unique sonotypes there were, and we can correlate that with our index of soundscape saturation. This graph has the saturation on the y-axis and the number of sonotypes. You can kind of think of them as species, but not quite, because it's possible that one species makes more than one sound. But roughly, we can think of it as number of species. You can see that the correlation between soundscape saturation and the sonotypes is far from perfect, right? It's a linear regression that explains about a third of the variation in the data, which is not perfect, but it is substantially better than what we can do with other existing indices. What is also, in my mind, an advantage is that it behaves similarly in different countries, in Myanmar, Borneo, and Papua New Guinea. So soundscape saturation is definitely not perfect, but it shows us roughly more or less species. So let me now show you how it actually behaves in the different forest types. So here we have time of the day of 1 day, so from midnight to midnight on the x-axis, and predicted soundscape saturation on the y-axis. And in green, dark green, is a protected forest that's intact, doesn't have any logging, any hunting. Light green is a forest that has some mild hunting, but this is just hunting by a local community, and it's nothing really substantial. And then in orange and gray, we have land uses where the forest has essentially been cut down in small patches, and people have established gardens or cocoa plantations. So it's kind of like the extreme, or like the fewest. It still has some bird species that come through, but relatively few compared to the protected forest. And what is striking, at least at kind of first pass, is that these forest sites have prominent peaks during the dawn and the dusk, and those peaks are missing from the plantation and garden sites. And as I mentioned earlier, during the dawn and dusk, that's when most birds do their thing. They vocalize the most, they establish their territory, they look for mates. And the fact that they're either not vocalizing or just completely gone, that is something that that we can tell from the soundscape. looking at a similar set of sites, but this time with like a little more intense land uses from Indonesian Borneo. We have intact forest again in green, and this time industrial selective logging in blue. So that's logging that still extracts only a few trees per hectare, but this time with like bulldozers and heavy machinery. And in orange and yellow, we have again non-forest land uses. So either plantations that are completely cut down and then you plant some palms or some vegetables, or teak plantation in yellow. And again, you can see that the intact forests have these peaks. They look a little bit different for the logged forest, so something is going on, but those peaks are smaller or missing for the non-forest land uses. We find something similar in Myanmar. Again, protected forest has higher soundscape saturation and bigger peaks than forest that is degraded or not protected or as a plantation.
The question actually in the last one, I saw that the impact of the two logging schemes was vastly different. So I guess the point is, are there more responsible variants of logging for species?
Yes, is the short answer.
Yeah.
This is something that we're trying to measure in much more detail, like what it is about the responsible logging that truly makes it responsible. Is it the number of trees you extract per hectare? Is it the time you wait between one extraction cycle until the next? Is it the size of the trees? Is it how well you plan your roads when you're extracting? Is it the fact that responsible logging companies have rules to prevent people from hunting? Like, what is it about this responsible logging that, yeah. So that's kind of the more nuanced part that we're looking into now. Yeah.
Okay, and so the difference actually I see, I'm not sure if it's a big pattern, is they also have dawn dusk peaks, which is interesting, but one of them is much quieter the rest of the time, at least at night.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yes. So the nighttime is that is something that is I find it very fascinating. And I'll actually talk about it a bit more in the second example, because at nighttime, actually the majority of the soundscape is taken up by insects, by these long ongoing cicada choruses. And it seems that those insects really like forest that is disturbed, whether it is because there's more light and that there's like fresh plants that grow that these insects chew on, that makes it more attractive, or whether it's something else, I don't know. But it does seem that like disturbance does increase the amount and even diversity of insects at night, which is something, yeah, that's transpiring from the soundscape research, and which interestingly we wouldn't really know otherwise, because people, when they do in-person biodiversity survey, they do it during these peak times. Nobody bothers to stay at night in the rainforest and count animals at that point. Yeah.
So then in that side, what does this do for forest management? I'm actually thinking of, say, California, which has been arguably undermanaged, or at least overmanaged, where there's too much undergrowth. Presumably that would reduce species, but maybe they're very happy to not be bothered and have a lot of undergrowth. So in terms of health, does this point to like ways of improving forest health, or leave it alone? Or I guess I guess I'm trying to figure out how does it guide what you do to make things better.
Yes, that's a really important question. It's a tricky one, and I think the answer will be very different in California to Borneo. So in California, I think and I don't know too much about it, but I think fire suppression and not having small but frequent fires has been a big issue. Um, and suppressing the fires will favor some species of birds. And they will show up in the soundscape, and they will be gone when we allow more fires. And if your goal as a manager or as a conservation practitioner is minimize danger of fires to humans, or maintain, forest as an ecosystem in the long run, then maybe you'll prioritize that, and you don't care about the few species that will not like it. But if your goal is to protect, I don't know, one species of woodpecker that really does or does not like fire, then you will proceed differently. So it's kind of like a trade-off. But in Indonesia, it definitely seems to be emerging that preventing hunting in these managed forests is one important issue, because hunters are targeting, and this might be surprising, are targeting songbird species that they hunt as pets. They want to, so like, yeah, many people in Indonesia own birds as pets, and so those are being illegally poached, and not allowing these poachers into the logging concessions might actually be even more important for biodiversity than the logging itself. Yeah.
Interesting. All right, cool. Thank you.
Okay. So, summarizing this part of the talk, we do find some patterns in common across the different countries with different rainforests. And I should say that the types of animals in Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and Myanmar are vastly different. It's completely different assemblages of species. So even for me, the fact that we do find these peaks and the lack of them is quite surprising. Obviously, we want to see whether these patterns are valid beyond Southeast Asia and Oceania, so that we can start making some broader conclusions. And some of my lab members are working in Gabon and Sierra Leone to see that. I think I will skip this part on this in-between approach, which basically tries to divide the soundscape at least roughly into insects and invertebrates. And I might skip to the individual-based species approach, so that we have enough time to discuss.
Sounds great.
I'll show just one slide from the intermediate approach, which is we're able to divide the frequency of the soundscape into broad groups like birds and insects, amphibians, according to their frequency. We're able to divide birds from insects, and we're less able to divide frogs and mouse. So just using the frequency of animal species will not be enough to really tell even groups of species apart. That's why this individual species-based approach is very important and relevant, because we do ultimately want to know not only there are 20 species, but which 20 species. Are they species that should be in the forest, or are they species that just are kind of generalist species that don't really require forest? So, our question, or my question originally in this part of the research was, can we train a model to recognize sounds automatically? And very quickly, I realized that most people who work in this domain use the pictures of the sounds to be recognized rather than the sounds themselves. So the problem or the question is, if we give an algorithm enough training data, whereby each training data point is one of these boxes that I talked about earlier, like boxes of a spectrogram, when we present the model with a new sound, can it say which of our original species it is? And the answer is yes, and other people have done this. I'm definitely not the first one. There are quite a few relatively well-functioning models. All of these are based on convolutional neural networks, and they look at birds, frogs, and some of them at bats. The probably the most famous one is BirdNet, which you might know. It's an app that you can download, and you can point it at any bird in the US, and it will quite well analyze what species you're hearing. The biggest limitation of the existing neural networks is that they, of course, is I guess all neural networks need a lot of training data. And that is why they are pretty limited to the species they can identify. So for example, BirdNet can identify, I think, about 500 bird species from North America and Europe. But those are the most studied organism in the world. Birds are vastly overstudied in North America and Europe. For Indonesia or Gabon or Mexico, we have much less training data. So one question I wanted to know is how much training data is actually enough when we are training a network to recognize these spectrograms. I wanted to know because for a model to be useful to conservation at this point, it needs to be kind of small and easily usable by someone who doesn't really know much coding, someone who will not spend thousands and thousands of hours generating new training data. And it would have to be a model that can recognize all animal sounds, not just North American birds. And they can also, look at frogs and insects and so on, because those are really important part of the soundscape. And the model should have reasonable accuracy, but it doesn't have to be 100%. At this point in conservation, we go for anything that has at least more than 70-80% accuracy.
To what extent is it reasonable to say it's a different species? I have no idea what it is, like clustering as opposed to identification.
Can you repeat that?
To what extent is clustering good enough to say this is different species from anything else I have from proper identification?
Yes, that is extremely useful.
Okay.
In tropical forests. So even just knowing, okay, I have 10 different sounds or 10 different likely species. I don't know what they are, but I know that there are 10 different things is super useful, even if we don't know, oh, this is the gray parrot and
right. Well, thank you.
So that's kind of what we try to do with my collaborators, and this has also been a really interesting experience as an ecologist to work closely with computer scientists. We both had to kind of like learn the jargon of each discipline. And if you'll have very detailed questions about the model, then you'll have to ask my collaborators. But I want to tell you from my perspective as an ecologist. So our training data looked a bit like this. So this is one species, the great argus from Indonesia. And we might have 3 examples of a call by this argus. And you can see the 3 spectrograms. They look quite different, but if I play them to you, you would be able to tell, okay, this is the same species. So this is just to show that, that these are different pictures, but by the same species. The major challenge we have been facing is that our sample sizes are extremely imbalanced. So we have few species or few sonotypes that would be really common. So here, for example, our argus we had it 90 times in our data set, but the vast majority of species have very few examples. We even have a long tail of species that we heard fewer than 3 times. And it's really hard to build any model with such a skewed data set. So that's why we try to use data augmentation to at least make up for some of that imbalance. And we augmented the data by changing the spectrograms a little bit, like squeezing, stretching, and so on. And then by adding other sounds like rain or wind, or even overlaying with other species. So basically as inputs, we use these spectrograms of different sonotypes. We then did data augmentation. We used transfer learning so that we wouldn't be building the model from scratch. And our output, we wanted to know, basically, given one sonotype, tell us what is its sonotype number, so that we can know, okay, is this a different sonotype or the same species? This is what the model architecture looked like. And I can put that up later on so that you can look in detail. I'll show you how it was, for me, surprisingly successful. So we tested the model with and without data augmentation, with and without transfer learning. And on the right side, the box plot on the right side is with both data augmentation and transfer learning. We got pretty high accuracies for our data set. We still obviously need to test it. Is this going to work on a new data set from somewhere else? But for our data set, it worked relatively well. And for me, the most exciting thing was that it worked really well even at extremely small sample sizes. So we set 3 as the minimum sample size so that we could have a separate set for training, testing, training, validation, and testing. But even at 3, it reached pretty high accuracies. And it didn't seem to matter. It didn't seem to be like biased towards, let's say, birds, or be less good at insects. It seemed like for all the taxonomic groups that we had, it performed relatively well. So going back to our criteria, it did require very little training data. It could classify all animal sounds, not just birds and not just the common ones. And it did have reasonable accuracy. However, we still have a lot of limitations. And these are the next steps that I'm actually excited to talk about, because I'm genuinely looking for potential collaborations or recommendations even. So one big challenge that we have, and that no machine learning approach that I've seen for audio has solved, but I'm sure that you might know better, is that when we have a lot of sounds happening at the same time, not just like one sound per second, it's very hard to basically segment the spectrogram to recognize like individual bits, individual pictures that should be classified. So that's one challenge. How do we segment the spectrogram to present to the model, okay, identify this? Second big challenge is, how do we deal with sounds that are not belonging to any of the classes that we have trained the model on? And this is, I think, where really like the big improvements could be made, because we want to measure species richness. We want to measure how many different species, and we cannot do that if we're only looking for what we're looking for. We need to be considering all the sounds. And then the kind of nice things to have are making those algorithms easy to be run by people who don't necessarily know how to code, and then one day build an overall soundscape diagnostic tool that will combine both the soundscape indices where appropriate and these individual species approaches. So to conclude, I think that, or I hope that I've conveyed that Soundscapes will not solve all of our problems in biodiversity monitoring, but that they can be an important part of the solution. There are many different approaches. Each of them is a developing field, and each of them has its own limitation. And I think that's pretty much it that I would like to say. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to discuss any questions.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much. One thing that just occurs to me is, to throw another machine learning buzzword, is generating sounds. It seems like you can, one, you can start making more sounds from the same kind of species, especially when you have transfer learning, and you can start making more soundscapes because you know roughly what birds sound like, which is cute as an app, like the Cornell Ornithology Lab has. You know, you can put out bird sounds, but also you can start eliciting birds to start making more sounds because you're making sound from, I don't know what your species is, but I make more of your sounds. Is that feasible?
You mean kind of like playing sounds
Yeah,
in
playing
the
sound, like, well, like what, like an animal calls. You respond
yeah.
with not exactly the same call, which is one option, but a reasonable call from the same distribution.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it'll say something again.
Yeah. So people have used this technique, I would say, as long as humanity.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So people would like go to the forest and make a call of a species in the hope that they will attract it.
Yeah.
And usually it will be for like hunting purposes.
Right.
But yes, it could be interesting in this circumstance. I think it will be quite hard to do it for sufficient number of species, and you will still not get all of the variation. So like a lot of the variation in the signals come from the vegetation structure, comes from the time of the day, because weather influences how sound propagates, comes from the actual individual, like is it a grown-up male or is it a teenage chick or something like that. So I think, yeah, it's I like it, but I think it would still be a small data set.
Yeah, so to what extent do they respond? I guess. I mean, we don't care about attracting them closer. We just want to get more sounds
Yeah,
out of them. From what you said, dawn dusk is when they start chattering and on their own little band of the frequency space.
yeah. So some species are known to respond a lot and others not at all, because it also depends on why they are making sound. So some species might be making sound to say like, this is my territory, don't come here.
Fair.
Others are like responding like, okay, you are from my species, you said there is a new food resource, so then I'll respond to you. Others are making sounds to attract mates. So it really depends, yeah. And there's a lot of variation in the 10,000 species of birds that exist.
Yeah, it makes sense. So, to what extent? Because I mean, some of the difficult problems you're describing are it's hard to do them in small data sets.
Yeah.
But is it possible to say that the normal distance of a new species from existing species in Soundscape? Because then, if I know the distance between species, I have, I know when to put the boundary around the call. Like, so can you use like, well, the existing forest, zoos, something where you know what the distribution is between nearby species?
hmm Do you mean distance in terms of like the signal, like frequency?
Signal, yeah, because you
hmm
said like,
Yeah.
well, not knowing where the sound comes from a new class. Well, what's the normal distance between a known class and not that?
Yeah. 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 So for birds, that's something that I think is doable. And one PhD student in my lab is looking at all the calls of birds that we have, because there's a free online database of bird calls that people record, like citizen scientists basically.
Right.
And so he's looking at the frequency characterization of each species on these like million calls that exist or that are recorded. We don't know yet the results, but
Yeah,
I think that it's not only the distance in terms of frequency, like they're not necessarily lined up like, okay, I'm at 1.2 kilohertz and I'm at 1.225, but it's also the shape of the call.
yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely
Right.
tricky.
So speaking of which, you mentioned frequency and time. It seems like there's a whole Fourier decomposition here for all the different frequency space, and more so, there's, I imagine the basis is Fourier basis is not the right one. You really have a throat shape basis, really,
Yeah.
that determines the kinds of shapes that come out that are not frequencies. There's presumably something else.
Yes. Yes. And I think that that's one of the things to still experiment on, like what it is about the calls that is most identifying each class. Is it the frequency? Is it the frequency change over time? Is it the, I don't know, entropy of the sound within the bin? Yeah.
So that's where neural nets may be an appropriate thing, because this is now has become a standard thing, which is you find the embedding. You say, I have a bunch of bird calls, reproduce, take that as input, reproduce the same call as output, but make sure that the inside of the neural net is small, so it has no choice but to compress down the original signal to 20 dimensions, 100 dimensions, but
Mm-hmm.
all in the original soundscape. And the question is, what have you done, neural net? And figure like back, well, in some ways you don't even have to care. Just run the neural net, project it to that space and let go. That's your projection. Or you can try to figure out what features it is using to make the small approximation. And if you have enough bird calls, you might actually get a good approximation of what, well, it's actually maybe a brain analysis. What did they use to differentiate each other? That's beyond just frequencies. But that's like an encoder decoder, and it's like you project it into an embedding space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting.
And it's very common in text and whatnot. So speaking of text, I want to talk to birds, and this seems to get me pretty close to that, especially if you have birds where you do understand behaviors and when you do know that this is a call for that. How far away from will we from that, saying this bird is saying this, or I want to say to bird this, and it just like squawks that thing to that species?
Mm-hmm. I think we are closer to this in mammals.
Okay.
Like chimpanzees. I think chimpanzees are probably the best example, where people have like really identified like, oh, this kind of syllable means this.
Okay.
I haven't heard of this in birds.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
I
encouraging.
only know like people are able to do like, okay, we'll play an alarm call and birds will all fly up because they will think
Right.
it's a predator. But these are like pretty broad, pretty rough messages to send.
Right.
Whereas with primates, I think chimpanzees and then gibbons, there's been some work on gibbons. There it's closer. But I don't know. I'm not like expert in that field in animal community, as in like, yeah, one species expressions.
Right.
Mhm.
And then, so for these species, how many different calls would one species have?
So most bird species have one or two.
Okay.
There's like a big group of species that have a song and a call. Some species have only one, and then there's a minority of species that have more than one.
Okay, so it really is like there's only a few things to say, like alarm, mate.
Yeah,
Food?
this territory.
Oh, territory. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let me just actually switch from ecosystems to urban soundscapes or any civilizational thing. How usable is this to say, I guess, what kind of community I'm in? And rush hour, or is it overcrowded, or
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And I mean, people have been using soundscapes to detect things about urban spaces. The best example is gunshots. So the police in bigger cities uses kind of like an ambient soundscape to detect, okay, is a shooting going on?
right?
And yeah, traffic noise is another big thing that people have been recording. Interestingly, the kind of interface between human sounds and animal sounds is like a big study area. So people study like if you are birds and you live close to an airport, do you shift your sounds to
Right.
earlier in the day if airplanes are always starting to take off at 6:30 or something like that? And that is quite well documented. And there's a really cool example from COVID lockdowns in San Francisco when suddenly the traffic noise went way down. and birds dropped their frequencies because they no longer were competing with this low frequency sound of traffic.
Mhm.
So they dropped their frequency and also the amplitude, which was very interesting.
Huh, interesting. So is it feasible? Now I'm thinking like not focusing on the birds, focusing on the humans.
Mm-hmm.
There's walkability scores, there's light availability scores of a city. I'm now thinking of, yeah, how livable a city is based on the noise pattern. And this could also be nature. Like, how many birds can I hear while I'm
Yeah,
walking around? How many squirrels are in running around through backyards, if a squirrel calls?
yeah, I like it, and I think people have been focusing mostly only on the negative side, like
Yeah.
on the noise pollution. I haven't heard of anyone focusing on like the positive, like nature sounds as
Yeah.
a
So
livability score. Yeah, that's interesting.
I guess I'm now thinking of, there's a lot of criticism of more vertical urban living, even though in a lot of ways it's more efficient. Uh, but if you can promote more animals, because birds are the ones that are going to show up more in more urban landscapes, but that of course would require less car noise and whatnot. Maybe become more attractive
Hmm.
relative to suburbia, which is nice and green but has its own
Yeah,
problems.
yeah, could be interesting.
Okay. And then, okay, so one other thing. Um, the loudest individuals I know of are children. It's for in education, is it feasible to start using this kind of noise analysis to actually say how noisy it is? In some ways, it noise might be good. They might be excited, like gym class. In some ways, it's bad. But like how focused children are, that kind of that ecosystem.
Mm. So you mentioned in education. Do you mean like in like a classroom
In
setting?
classroom, yeah, because
Mhm.
measuring, it's hard
Measuring
to
it.
know whether children are learning. I mean, from many dimensions.
Yeah.
And this, I've never heard of anybody looking at how much noise are they making, how much they're bothering each other. And it's a
Mhm.
dimension that may actually be usable.
Hmm. It's like a measure almost of like attention on task,
Exactly.
kind of.
Because one
Yeah.
attractive thing about online learning is that you at least every time they click something, you see it.
Yeah.
But you're missing vast amounts of information about where they're looking. Are they distracted?
Yeah.
Putting a camera in front of everybody's faces is, well, in addition to privacy, also is,
Yeah.
differently. Well, it's just different.
Yeah.
Audio might be a rather interesting, like ambient thing of like, or if individual species analysis. Tommy is being loud.
Yeah.
That might actually be rather relevant to a teacher, like
Yeah.
one teacher of that class, who might be
Yeah.
able to interpret that.
Yeah, that's true. And there is like so I don't know, when I get teaching evaluation in the classes I teach, the evaluators take measurements like what proportion of students are looking at their screen and what are looking at me. So yeah, this could be an additional metric.
Actually,
Um,
now you have a population to study. That might be kind of
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. Interesting idea.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, this is fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion and interesting questions. And yeah, I'm definitely looking for ways to scale this all up,
Mhm.
to be able to use more data, easily share with collaborators. So also any ideas in the future you might have along those lines, that's
Absolutely, yeah. And hopefully, folks that are in the audience will also pick
yeah,
up on this and have connections for you.
great. All
All right.
right.
Well, thank you very much.
Have a
Have
good
a
day. Bye.
good day. Bye.